All right, so here's where this actually becomes important. If you want to understand the pattern, you really have to begin earlier than Israel. You have to begin with Adam. Because before there was a nation, before there was a priesthood, before there was a monarchy, there was one man standing at the center of the human story. Adam stands in God's presence, represents the human family, and is given dominion over the earth. So even before priesthood is formalized, before sacrifice is codified, before law is written down in civil or ceremonial form, you already have the basic shape of the thing. You have humanity represented in one man before God, and you have authority over the world entrusted to that same man. Now, I would be careful not to press that into a formal priesthood because that language belongs to later structures. Sin has not yet ruptured the relationship, so there's no need for mediation in the later sense. But the pattern is there in seed form. Adam stands as the representative of earth in the heavenly realm, and he bears authority within the earthly realm itself. So in that sense, the roles that later become divided are, at the beginning, still together. And then he falls, and once that happens, the unity is lost. And the issue is not that the role itself was wrong. The issue is that the one carrying it failed. And with that failure, the human story fractures. Death enters, corruption enters, alienation enters. And from that point on, you no longer have a stable union of sacred representation and earthly rule held together in one fateful human life. So instead, history begins to splinter. You get rival claims, broken systems, unstable rulers, false worship, competing powers. And in a real sense, everyone is trying to recover some piece of what was lost. Everyone wants authority. Everyone wants mediation. Everyone wants access to the divine, control over order, legitimacy over other people. But after the fall, no one can carry the whole thing without distortion. And that is the backdrop for everything that we're going to talk about. So when you come to Israel, Israel is not just another nation among nations. It is a theocratic arrangement. The civil structure itself is bound up with divine law. In other words, moral authority and governing authority are not cleanly separated. The nation is being ordered under God in a way that on the surface might seem like the answer to the problem. If God's law is perfect, then a people ordered by that law should produce justice. But that is not what happens. And again, the reason is not the law. The law is not deficient. The issue is the human carrier. The issue is who bears authority inside the system. Because over time, what scripture shows is that fallen humanity cannot sustain the convergence of those roles. Human beings cannot permanently bear sacred authority and ruling authority in a way that remains uncorrupted. They fail morally, they die, they are replaced, and every succession reintroduces instability. So even in Israel, the structure itself begins to tell you something. The roles are differentiated. Moses is not Aaron, and Aaron is not the king. Kings are not priests, and priests are not kings. That separation is not arbitrary. It is already signaling a boundary. It is as though the biblical text is saying, after the fall, this cannot simply be handed back in its original form. And that is why Melchizedek matters so much. Melchizedek is not important merely because he appears briefly. He matters because he preserves the idea of unified priesthood and kingship without attaching it to the Israelite national system. He is a priest king, but not as part of an institutional model that Israel is meant to copy. He stands in the text more like a signpost than a bureaucracy. He keeps the category alive, per se. So now you have two things running side by side. On the one hand, history shows the instability of fallen human authority. And on the other hand, Revelation keeps open the idea that priesthood and kingship do belong together somehow. And that tension is not resolved by Israel. Israel dramatizes the problem. It reveals it. It shows what happens when divine law is placed into a world where the humans administering it are still subject to sin, mortality, and corruption. The system serves a purpose, but it's not final. It teaches, it exposes, it points beyond itself. And this is where Christ becomes not merely relevant, but necessary. Because Christ is not just another attempt at combining those roles. He's not a new version of the old instability. He is the fulfillment of what the earlier patterns were straining toward. You see, what Adam held and lost, Christ secures. What Israel could symbolize but not sustain, Christ embodies without collapse. And what Melchizedek foreshadowed, Christ fulfills in substance. And that is why the union finally holds in him. Not because the concept became safer, but because the person is different. He does not fail. He does not inherit corruption. He does not need to be replaced. He does not lose authority through death. So the very factors that made earlier configurations unstable do not terminate the role in him. And that changes how you read what comes next, because once Christ fulfills what these earlier forms were pointing toward, the restoration of a human theocratic order is no longer the goal. The expansion implied in the Great Commission does not move toward rebuilding Israel on a global scale. It moves outward in another way entirely. Now the Gentiles are brought in, not under a national law state, but into direct accountability before God through Christ and by the Spirit. Now that is a major shift. It means the people of God are no longer defined by a geopolitical structure that enforces divine law as civil order in the old sense. The relationship is no longer mediated through that political form. The people of God become transnational. The church is not a state. It is not a nation in the territorial sense. It is the people who belong to Christ. And in that sense, yes, the church reaches all the way back to the beginning because God's people always begin with those who belong to Him. But the mode changes after Christ. The structure changes, the expansion changes, which is why phrases about Gentiles being a law unto themselves have to be handled carefully. That does not mean chaos. It means that conscience, accountability, and response to God are no longer contained within the old national scaffolding. The buffer is removed. Responsibility becomes immediate. And that aligns with the logic of the Great Commission. Go into all nations, teach what Christ taught, call people to obedience, but do not confuse that with reconstructing a centralized civil religious order that absorbs the role only Christ can sustain. And that is why history becomes so interesting at this point. Because after the biblical text has already exposed the instability of these merged roles in fallen human systems, history keeps trying to rebuild them anyway. And this is where Rome becomes significant. What you see there is not merely religion in a private sense. You see a structure in which spiritual authority and real-world sovereignty converge in a visible institution. That is what makes it relevant to the pattern. It is not merely symbolic, it is structural. And that should raise the question, why does this keep returning? Why does fallen humanity repeatedly move toward systems in which sacred interpretation and governing power gather in the same place? Now, part of the answer, I think, is that human beings long for visible unity, visible certainty, visible mediation. We want a stable center that can tell us what is true and enforce that truth in history. But Scripture's larger pattern keeps warning that this arrangement does not remain stable in fallen hands. So when you step back, the arc becomes clearer. Adam gives you the original unity in undeveloped form before sin. The fall shatters it. Israel gives you a structured theocratic order that reveals the limits of fallen administrators. Melchizedek preserves the category of priest-king without institutionalizing it as the answer. And then Christ fulfills the pattern without the failure. And history again and again tries to reconstruct at the human level what only he can safely hold. And that is why the issue is not merely historical or denominational. It is structural, it is theological, and it is still contemporary. Because the question underneath all of it is this: who exactly can be trusted to hold both sacred authority and ruling authority without corruption? The biblical answer is not no one ever. The biblical answer is narrower and more unsettling than that. The answer is no fallen human system can carry it. That space is not abolished, it is reserved, and it remains reserved until all things are made new. Only then does humanity share in a restored way in what was lost at the beginning, not as independent claimants to ultimate authority, but through the one who secured it without failure. So until then, every attempt to totalize human authority in that direction steps into something it cannot fully sustain, and that is the tension we are still living in now.